In the Newsroom is a production in partnership with Studio Stillwater. Every week, journalists from the Stillwater News Press invite listeners to join us in the newsroom and hear the story behind the stories. Hello and welcome to In the Newsroom. I am Beau Simmons, editor of the Stillwater News Press, joined by city editor Michelle Charles. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, how are you today?
All right, just the two of us.
I know. Well, Chris is here. Chris is back.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was about to get into that because we have Chris with us. Is this the most ambitious thing we've tried to do production-wise?
I think this is the most produced in the newsroom we have done to date, yes.
That's right. This is a very special episode because we're going to have some of your Stillwater interviews, your Stillwater movie film interviews.
Yes. When you say a very special episode, I feel like Blossom, though. I'm expecting to learn an important life lesson.
We don't do that here, do we? Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. Today, this show, or however we do it, it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to get to hear some of your interviews with director Tom McCarthy and Kenny Baker, who, I don't know if we describe him as, is he the inspiration? You would know. Is he the inspiration, or is he just sort of a what do they call that in the movie business when people sort of help out and they like tell people what the job is, and
right.
The advisory role.
I think he started out as more of an advisor.
Yeah.
And I think maybe he became a little bit of inspiration right. As time went on. It seems like he developed a real relationship with the filmmakers. I mean, when I was interviewing him, he was saying, yeah, we text all the time. We were just texting today. Yeah,
and we should say he's been all over the place. He's been on every TV station, but Kenny Baker is the Oklahoma oil field person that they used in the Stillwater film to sort of show him the lay of the land, right?
Exactly. To kind of give them a feel for what it was like to work in the oil field and to provide some authenticity to that portrayal. And it wound up being everything from the way he dresses to the way he talks to the way he pronounces specific words and how he carries himself.
Right. Yeah. So we'll get into that a little bit further on here, but getting back on track because we took about a week off and we'd almost started discussing ourselves in terms of post-pandemic. And Stillwater, we actually got to go to the theater and see it, the theater. And see it. And who knows how long that's going to happen.
I know, we were so close. It felt like we were so close to the end, right? And no, we're not.
Yeah, so, and you covered the city council meeting this last week where they discussed it, and it got interesting, didn't it? It was the first time in a long time we've sort of had that almost public hearing kind of vibe where everyone had a lot to say. So what happened there?
Indeed. We heard a lot from, primarily from people who are concerned and who want people to be aware and to take precautions. Early on, we didn't have a vaccine. The only tools we had available to us were masking and social distancing and I guess prayer. I don't know. I mean, it seemed like people weren't they didn't feel like they had a whole lot.
Right. And the treatment really didn't change. The game for treating it didn't change until, December?
Exactly.
It's like even then, if you were already in poor health with comorbidities, and you got to the treatment late, you still had, you're going to be in bad shape.
Oh, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've got some decent therapies now. But, I mean, early on, we had people doing crazy stuff like going to the veterinary supply and buying cattle wormer and stuff. It was nuts. My daughter worked for a veterinarian who actually was limiting the amount of ivermectin he would sell to patients, and he would only sell it to people that who he knew were actually using it for what they said it was for. It got that bad.
So they had quite a few people.
Quite a few people.
Had little testimonies come up, and was it mainly just to say like, look, things aren't getting bad; they're sort of already here.
Yes.
And it was, a lot of it was focused on hospitalizations and things like that.
Exactly. That is a lot of it because, we're not seeing as much of it out in the community yet, but the hospital is already getting hammered. It's been a long year and a half for them. They are tired. And, when they have to stand up once again and try to convince people that this is real and talk about how tired they are and how hard it is. I mean, Liz Michael, the nursing director for Stillwater Medical, said that the profession has lost like 25% of its bedside nurses since the pandemic started. Nursing has never been an easy job. It's long hours. You're on your feet. The patients don't feel great, and they're not always very nice to you. The doctors are not always as nice to you as they could be. It's a stressful job. And so then you throw in a pandemic and then people feeling like, do I need to separate myself from my family to keep them safe? Sleeping in hotels sometimes, sleeping in a separate bedroom from the rest of your family, taking your clothes off in the garage before you walk in.
We have another variable, which we didn't have before, and that is younger people. This is not what people are saying, but I would have to imagine, not too many people say this publicly, but I got to imagine if you're in the medical field, I'm sorry, but it's probably harder if you're in that COVID unit or IC unit and those patients come in younger and younger. That's harder.
Well, I would agree because it's, early on, it was, I think, somewhat comforting. This sounds weird, but I think it was somewhat comforting for people to be able to say, well, it's the elderly, right, or it's people who have comorbidities, because these are people you expect to not be as healthy. These are people, and if you have comorbidities, if you have type 2 diabetes, if you have heart disease, if you have, any of the lung diseases that come from smoking or whatever, there's probably a contingent of people in our society who might not openly say it, but who kind of feel like, whatever happens to you, you brought on yourself. And as someone who's overweight, I kind of take that personally. I've seen people say, well, I take care of myself and I eat well and I take supplements and therefore I don't have to worry about it. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, that's nice. But, so, there has been judgment. There has been, I think, an attempt to find reasons that people were getting sick, which then makes the people who aren't getting ill or haven't gotten ill yet and maybe don't want to have to take a lot of precautions feel safer, right? It's like they're creating psychological distance between themselves and the people who have the disease. Now you've got young, healthy people in the hospital, and it's harder and harder to create that psychological space.
Right. And one of the tools we had to prevent this, vaccinations, could have kept the mutations at bay.
Exactly.
It's really simple logic that says if you would have slowed down the spread, these mutations may not have turned into what they are now they reach younger, healthier people, and it's much more contagious, much more virulent.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've heard different numbers. I've heard, some say that, every person who is positive for the Delta variant has the potential to infect 6 people. Then the other day I heard 9 people. I don't know what the actual number is. I just know it's a lot of people. That's what I know.
It's worse.
It's worse.
It's worse.
That's the point.
Yep.
It is worse.
So we heard from that, but it wasn't really actionable, was it? It was a proclamation that sprang from that.
It was strongly encouraging people to follow CDC guidelines, okay, is what it was. And also pointing out that private businesses have the ability to require masks and social distancing. Those are their policies. They have the ability to do that. And the City of Stillwater Police Department, if you don't choose to follow their requests, they can ask you to leave. And if you refuse to leave, then you can be declared to be trespassing.
And then at
that point, the police could become involved.
But hasn't that almost always been the thing for private business?
Absolutely.
You can trespass almost anyone you want to.
Absolutely.
For any reason. Yeah.
People get told that, they can't go into Walmart because they were caught shoplifting. Right. You are trespassed at that point. You are not allowed to go into Walmart anymore. So yes, it has always been a thing. But people, I think a lot of times don't realize that. They think of private businesses as public places because the public goes into them all the time. So, I mean, that was really it, though. It was just a strong recommendation. Having said that, after hearing from Liz Michael about the situation at Stillwater Medical and all the other things we're hearing about, because we are in a hot zone, right? I mean, we are right next to Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana and all of these states where every hospital is full, and it is creeping over the border and working its way across our state.
And our population is about to double.
Exactly. So, I mean, our city councilors individually were also concerned and felt like, particularly John Wedlake, who is a physician, said he felt that the resolution didn't really go far enough. It's just words, as you said in an editorial. He was really calling for more than words. He really needed something. He needed something with some teeth in it, is what he would like to see, and they'll be talking about that. We'll see what happens.
And I'm curious. That's another thing. We mentioned businesses. And, I understand people saying, well, what good will it do? It's like we've gone this far. People have sort of made their choices or dug in. Well, for one thing, we do see more people we've seen a spike in vaccinations, and we've seen a spike in younger people being vaccinated. But also, if you remember, when they did the mandate, that gave freedom to businesses. They didn't need it. But for whatever reason, they decided that also allowed them to do the mandates. No, I don't know why, but it was like they were waiting on the government and then they would follow.
It provides them with cover.
Yeah.
Because they can say, it wasn't our idea. We're following a city ordinance. And therefore, they don't have to worry as much about alienating their customers. Because honestly, otherwise, it becomes like either a political, an ideological, a psychological, whatever litmus test, and if you have that city mandate, that's all taken away. You're just following the law, man. You don't have a choice. And I think that simplifies things a lot.
But Ashlyn's not here, but she also had an anecdote, which it would have been interesting for her to share with us, because she was in Chandler last weekend, right? Yes. I can't remember what weekend that would have been, but sort of after everything started happening in Arkansas, right. She said she went into a Chandler Walmart and they were just handing out masks at the door as people entered. And nothing had changed within the state. But that day, Walmart had changed to say its associates, that's what they call their employees, its associates would start masking. And I think some of them thought that, the mask mandate's back on. I think some some Walmart managers sort of took that upon themselves, thinking that meant the masks are back, so we're doing this again.
Right.
And then they got a little more clarity maybe to determine that, right now it's just for, if it's not state mandate, then it's just for the employees, not necessarily customers.
Or they got some pushback. There's always that possibility too.
Yeah.
And they couldn't, and again, they didn't have that cover.
It's weird to think of Chandler Walmart as being the outlier.
There was a banner outside of our Walmart for a while, encouraging masks, saying that masks were encouraged, or asking people to wear them. And then it stayed up for about a day, and then it came down. But of course, Walmart is headquartered in Arkansas, which is, ground zero for a lot of this stuff. So. And it's to the point where the governor of Arkansas, who was strongly anti-mask mandate, is reconsidering some positions as we speak. So
all right, that's sort of our local rundown. We can now sort of dive into the Stillwater film, maybe wrap it up, but it's now people have got to see it. People have. Did about third opening weekend, did about 5 million opening weekend, which I think was sort of in their ballpark.
Okay.
What they were expecting. So what I hear from a lot of people, and I know some people went into that like I thought they would, expecting some kind of thriller or something. So they said the story they were okay with. Everyone really did, I think, like Matt Damon's performance. But the ending, they needed I feel like a film snob, because it seems like an American audience needed a satisfying ending, and they didn't get one. So, You first spoke to director Tom McCarthy.
Yes, he also wrote the movie.
And yeah, he wrote the movie, but he did a little bit of background. And so, yeah, tell us just sort of how, I think that just started with an email from Focus Features, but, we got lucky. We said, what if it's some kind of incredible, elaborate prank? Not a prank.
It was not.
You spoke to an Academy Award-winning director about his film.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, usually it feels like it's us trying to do a sell job. I'm always going, well, I'm with the Stillwater News Press, which you've never heard of, but, I'm part of CNHI, and we have almost 100 papers in 23 states, and we share content, and this could be seen across the country, and, and I kind of have to sell it to people and explain that we do share our content, and that this could get a lot of eyeballs, and I don't know how many it actually gets, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. This time they came to us, which was super exciting. And also why we thought it was a prank. Anyway, they set up interviews though, and they contacted us and said, well, which of the talent would you be interested in interviewing? And I just thought, well, good grief, why would you even have to ask? Obviously, Matt Damon was at the top of the list. And then Tom McCarthy, is the writer and director.
But you were an Abigail Breslin fan
from
her early work, right?
I would have loved to talk to Abigail Breslin just because I think that she has had a fascinating career so far. And someone who is able to navigate those rocky, the rocky terrain that is child stardom is, I think that's a pretty amazing story. And actually, Kenny Baker told me that Abigail Breslin texted his daughter, they met the whole crew. His family went out for the movie premiere in New York. And he said Abigail Breslin texted his daughter to make sure they got back home to Oklahoma. Okay.
Oh, that's really nice.
So he was like, she was great, Anyway, so I think, I would have loved that. But Tom McCarthy was fascinating. He was the one who developed the project. And I was really interested in, why Oklahoma? What put us on the radar and what was he thinking as he was approaching it?
Okay, so the moment I've all been waiting for. Let's go ahead and we'll take a listen to your interview with director Tom McCarthy.
Hi, Michelle. Tom here. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Tom?
I'm pretty well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. So we were able to see the film on Tuesday.
Great.
And we really enjoyed it. I have
to say, nice to hear. I'm very curious to hear what your point of view on it, or what your reaction to it. I'm very curious, being from Stillwater.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it did obviously, prompt a few questions, but I think when I'd heard thriller, I was expecting more along the lines of, people were making jokes about being like Taken or things like that. I don't think people really knew what to expect, and it was so much more subtle than that. It was very affecting, I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we were actually, on some level anticipating that people might think it was Taken, but I think the writers and ultimately my filmmaking team felt like we've told those stories. Those stories have been told, those thrillers have been made, and we really wanted to do something with a little bit more human dimension and scope and challenge the perception of that type of movie and what it could be, and maybe ultimately talk about consequences to actions and what that means. So I think that's what makes it a different type of movie than any one particular genre movie.
Definitely we could see that. Now, the question that everyone here wants to know is, why Stillwater? I mean, what is it? Just the sound? Is it what puts Stillwater, Oklahoma on your radar as a location?
That's a good question. It was many years ago, almost 10 years ago, when I started thinking of this. And, in the same way that people would say, why Marseille? And I got that from the French a lot. Why Marseille? That's an interesting choice. I was like, I was a guy in New York City thinking about this story and thinking about the two locations that this movie would toggle between and the two cultures. And I was just sort of looking at the map, literally in my office, staring at a map and being like, wow, what's interesting to me? And I think what I started with was was the young woman's journey. Like, okay, this is a woman who I think she's probably the first in her family to go to college. I think she's somewhere from the middle of the country. I want her to be in a landlocked place, and I want her to end up somewhere very different. And so I just started looking at it, and really Stillwater just caught my eye. I was like, oh, that's cool. I wonder what Stillwater, Oklahoma is like. And I'm like, oh, wow, Oklahoma State is in Stillwater. That's really interesting. And I started doing a deeper dive into Stillwater and the history of Stillwater and Oklahoma in general, because I had never been. I'd never been to Oklahoma at that point. I was a guy in an office in New York who was just like looking at the country and being like, where's a culture in a place I don't know? And then the more I dug, I thought, wow, this is a really specific culture, a really specific sort of window into America that I don't really understand. And again, this is 10 years ago. Probably at a point where our country was a little bit less divided and fractured. So that's really where it began. And then finally I was like, hey, I'm just going to go there. I'm just going to get on a plane. This is literally how I work. I sort of work like a journalist in that regard.
Okay.
Got on a plane. I got off in Oklahoma City. I started calling around. I knew one guy in Tulsa,
right.
An actor I worked with many years ago. I knew a filmmaker in Tulsa. I said, hey, I want to go check out Stillwater. This one guy's like, oh, I know Stillwater pretty well. I went to Oklahoma State. I'll take you there. I ended up staying on the campus there, walking around the town. I think I saw my first Red Dirt music one night there. And I just felt like, oh, this feels right. Just that. And then I started doing a deeper dive into like the roughneck culture and sitting with a bunch of roughnecks in that area and in other areas throughout Oklahoma. And I really like the tie to the university. I like that element, that there's this, like, at the heart of this town, like there's this massive university. By the way, that is an impressive university. I just couldn't believe how big and beautiful it was. And that was it. That's where I got drawn in. And I think, ultimately there was something in the name Stillwater specifically for this guy, this very stoic, difficult to read man who has obviously a lot of baggage and a lot going on underneath the surface. There was something in that I like thematically that felt very right, specifically for Bill Baker. And that's the best answer I can give you all these years later.
One thing that really jumped out at me as I was talking to Tom was the idea that Oklahoma is an exotic place to some people.
That was almost the exact thought I was having from that interview, that we are culturally dynamic in a way, that's so foreign to someone from New York City.
Yes.
Like,
yeah. That really struck me. I mean, he was fascinated by Oklahoma and the idea that we're sort of emblematic for him of a certain type of American or a certain type of American experience. And I thought that was really interesting, because I just think we're living our lives, and
that's the only refinement we care about is oil.
Exactly. A little bit, yeah. But so that really surprised me as I was talking to him, and then I was a little gratified to find that, my initial thought that the idea of Stillwater's running deep, that kind of play on words, was also part of what drove the decision. So I felt kind of smart there for a second.
Yeah, it's sort of, you get the image of a quiet surface with who knows what underneath, right? And
exactly.
That was sort of what he was drawn to that, I guess.
Exactly. And very impressed with OSU. I'm assuming he probably stayed at the Atherton Hotel. Went around town and saw some Red Dirt music and enjoyed it. You'll hear he developed a great fondness, actually, for a lot of people here.
Yeah. Let's listen to some more.
It's interesting, though, because it seems almost sort of prescient. Bill Baker he's obviously very American, but he's a very specific type of American. And it feels in the movie like Bill is almost like, not a caricature, but like in some people's minds, maybe in other places, like a prototypical American, an example of the things that they maybe don't think are great about our country.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Like, I was writing with two French guys, and they thought he was super cool. You know? And honestly, I had the same reaction. Look, I really started going to Stillwater in 2016, 2017, right? That's when I really started, like, spending more time in Oklahoma and really sitting with roughnecks and interviewing them. And just to be quite frank, the country could not have been more divided. Everyone was us and them, red and blue. You know, it was just like, we were at the height of the country was just in a frenzy coming off that election, right? And you could just feel it everywhere. And I was like, I'm going to go to Oklahoma. I'm going to go spend time with a filmmaker from New York and a bunch of roughnecks. And it was great. It was great. And I remember thinking, I came back and I was talking with my wife about it that night. I was like, you know, it's incredible. Like, I spend time with these guys and they're just cool. They work hard. They just have these like fascinating lives. They're really specific in terms of their characteristics, right? Like a really specific subculture of America, even of Oklahomans.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like,
yes.
they're like iconic on the landscape. Like, I remember I had this scout. I got to remember her name. She was great. The first time I was there, she was driving me around. And we walked in a restaurant. And without blinking, she goes, "Oh, that's a bunch of roughnecks over there." Just like that. And I was like, can you even say that? And it was like the first time I'd heard it referred to as that. I'm like, how do you know? She's like, how they're dressed, what they're doing, they're on lunch break. You know, she just knew them, right? It was like a little barbecue joint in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's that identifiable? And she's like, yeah. And I remember I called the writers. I'm like, okay, Bill Baker's got to be a roughneck. These guys are interesting. And there's a reality and a mythology to those particular men, which I found fascinating the more I spent time with them. But my takeaway was I went back and I was talking to my wife and I was like, it like, you know what it cemented for me? How much politics divides us. And I was angry about that. I was like, you know what? There's so many interesting people in this town in this country that like, we're all like pointing fingers at. Everyone's doing it, both sides. And we should be celebrating those differences because they're just fascinating. They're fascinating people. They're interesting people. And we're, you know, it sounds corny, but like we all are Americans, right? And we should be celebrating. Like the French guys thought this was just the coolest thing ever. Like, what a cool culture. I'm like, yeah, I know. And I went back to New York and I was like, man, it gives me hope, right? Because politics aside, like, it's just really interesting. And like I said, and you know, I got to be honest, Michelle, it's a tough thing for me to talk about because it sounds kind of corny. But when everything's so upside down, like it was specifically in that moment in time, there was something really, I don't know, there's a really positive takeaway from the research I was doing. It seems simplistic maybe and a bit reductive, but it was undeniable.
That's good to hear. I mean, people are people. I mean, honestly, and most people want the same things. They just have different ways of thinking. You
know what the problem is? You're right, and that the different ways of thinking is beautiful. But the problem is the country's so damn big. Most people don't get to other places, myself included. And I've traveled quite a bit through this country, but like not enough, right? And as soon as we do travel to these other places, whether it's a New Yorker going to Oklahoma or an Oklahoman coming to New York, and you get to sit with and talk to, you go back to wherever you're from and you feel differently about those people because they're no longer statistics. They're no longer political sound bites. They're human beings. You're like, hey, you say what you want. That guy's a good guy. You know, that roughneck might vote different than me. He might feel different than me, but like I've spent time with him. Like he's a decent guy who cares about his family and his friends. Like, don't judge him on that, you know? And I feel like as Americans, we're just too siloed right now. We don't know each other well enough. Some of that's because it's so big and some of it's our own laziness. But whenever we can break out of that bubble, like our own bubbles, and we all have them, and get to know the people that we call our countrymen, the net effect of that's pretty powerful, right? And that's what I have hope in. I don't have a lot of hope in politicians. That ship has sailed for me, man. I just don't believe in the system that well. But I have a lot of hope in the people, and I have a lot of hope in the different ideas. Like, I celebrate that.
I don't know. What do you think about that when he's talking about the politics?
Well, I think that's where you sort of learn the lesson just by meeting people, because so much exposure, so much what we think is exposure to other people and cultures comes from this social media, which is not a reflection of reality. That's just the loudest kids in a classroom trying to shout over each other. That's the bathroom wall graffiti of, you know, the world. That is not an example of what real people are like in the real situations. Most of us are just out here trying to make a living, you know. just going to work, going to our favorite lunch spot with our friends, and then going home. And then when you get on the Twitter or the whatever else, it becomes a garbage site for, crazy people.
I think that is a real difference too. And just the fact that they got to know these guys, the more they got to know them, the more human they became to them, not just an archetype or a stereotype or someone you've seen on social media or, defined by any certain characteristic or how they vote, not a demographic.
Right.
But a person.
Not a 5-second clip of someone. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. It made a huge difference. And Matt Damon made the same sort of comments. And I think that these folks really did develop a real relationship with each other. And that was, and that was a really cool thing. We got a couple more minutes of the interview. I'll go ahead and play that. At the end of the movie, I was looking at Bill and I was really thinking about how he was changed by his experience, because this is a guy, I'm having trouble picturing him going maybe beyond Texas, probably is not widely traveled, has obviously had some trouble. Not a guy who's likely to head out to France just, because, or to deal with people outside of his culture. How did Bill change by the end of the movie? What did you want people to see about Bill?
What you were thinking about in that last scene is exactly what I want people to think about and to consider that in terms of others and themselves. What ultimately is my sort of thesis for that is mine, right? And I don't think it's my job to answer it for audiences. It's my job to raise that question and make people think about just that. Would Bill have gone to that place? Would he be changed? How much has he changed? And maybe most importantly, what did he do with that change, right? There's an obvious, the ending, I think, emotionally is pretty complex, right? There's something very somber about it, and there's something perhaps hopeful. It's playing out on a few different levels. You can see it in Matt's eyes in that final close-up, and you can hear it in the line of dialogue that he says, about how he's seeing the world now. The question is, where does he go from there? And I think that's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And I think you're right. I imagine Bill, as a roughneck, was probably on the West Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma track, right? The triangle. Right. Maybe he spent time in Alaska at one point working on rigs in the North Slope. I don't know. But, really what's most interesting to me is that, he was in some way pushed to go visit his daughter in this place. And, that experience, especially when it went off the rails, which it obviously did during the story, right. It opened him up in a way. And unexpectedly providing him with a real shot at sort of a different life and redemption. That to me is really interesting. That's what I wanted to explore in this story, and what that goes back to in terms of Americans and who we are. How much we push ourselves to sort of poke out of our bubbles, and what can happen when we do that. But there's, obviously it's a pretty layered movie. But I think just that you're sitting there having those conversations or that thought, and then hopefully conversations with your colleagues afterwards, I feel like, okay, that's where I wanted this movie to be pitched. Those are the conversations I wanted to have with the audience.
Very good. And just one quick question. Oklahoma's film incentive program, does that help at all? Do you think that is part of what's bringing more and more movies to the state?
Definitely. It's so smart. I've tried to make other films in other states, and it just creates jobs. It creates exposure. It's just like opening up places, right? It's opening them up to who knows the net effect, right? The ripple effect of bringing other industries in and exposing them to other states, to other cultures, to other people, right? To me, it's a win-win. And I will say, the Oklahoma Film Commission, the mayor's office, in Stillwater, everyone really just reached out. They continue to reach out. They were just incredibly supportive and helpful and open, and there was just a lot of goodwill around the project from the state. And even that, you got filmmakers coming in from East Coast and West Coast and France and everywhere in between. And it's I just like the idea of all those people getting together, with our Oklahoma crew. I just think that's all cool. I just think that's positive. That's progress in some way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's nice to talk to someone from Stillwater. It's cool.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you ever make it back, come by the News Press and say hi to us.
I will indeed.
Great interviewing by you to get to that, because we don't want to give away the end.
Right.
But, a lot of people have talked about the end of the film, and, so you specifically ask him about that, and he brings it back to the character-driven nature of this movie. And that's why I've been defending the ending, because I try to tell people this ending is about his character's growth. It is not about a plot device or a plot that a story being wrapped up necessarily. It's his journey through it. So that's what you're left with. And I think you got that, and he's glad that you got that.
Right. So. Yes, he seemed very happy that we picked up on that.
Right.
I would imagine it's tough as a filmmaker to have these ideas in mind and then to see people completely miss it, or, to have it not land at all. That would have to be profoundly disappointing, I would think.
It's
so
hard
he seemed very happy.
It's hard to talk about without giving it away, but I just know that,
exactly.
Like when we were looking through our comments, I asked people what they thought. You've asked a lot of people what they thought,
right.
And they sort of get stuck on that. And, I can't just sit there and argue with every single person like, well, it's not really about the story so much as it is about, what this one character went through and how, he's changed as a person. That's still not satisfying for folks. So, it's going to be what it's going to be.
There are all kinds of stories about test audiences who changed the ending of movies, right?
Right.
Where it wasn't a sufficiently happy ending, where, the Pretty in Pink, they didn't like Andy ending up with Ducky. So she had to wind up with Blaine. I mean, people have these preconceived ideas of maybe what they want to see, a happy ending or whatever. And I would say that Stillwater is it's a very layered film. And I would say it's a very, I don't want to say adult film because that sounds like, a X-rated movie. But I mean, it's a very mature film, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very thoughtful. And, it's not just a mindless sort of action movie. And it's not simple. And it requires a little bit of the viewer to really think about it. And I think it's worth people's time, definitely. I mean, I've seen it twice now. There were 2 different screenings I went to. So and I will say this, the first time I was preparing for these interviews and I was so nervous that I just sat there and frantically took notes. You sat next to me and I sat there with my notepad taking notes in the dark through the entire movie. And so I didn't really get to connect with it as much on an emotional level. Second time I went to see it, I cried. So, because I finally could just watch the movie and experience it. And Kenny Baker told me that it made him cry too. The second time he watched it, he said the first time he was too nervous because he was in a suit sitting next to a bunch of movie industry people.
Was his first time seeing, was it the New York film premiere?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. He said, you never watch a movie wearing a suit jacket. He was really super nervous. And the second time he saw it was, I believe, in Stillwater at that screening that the city of Stillwater had. And he said it made him tear up too.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear more. Kenny Baker, what he thought.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of this special episode of In the Newsroom. In part 2, you'll hear Michelle's interview with Kenny Baker and what it was like to interact with the Stillwater filmmakers. You'll also hear reactions to the movie from locals like Mayor Will Joyce, Councilor John Wedlake, and Kenny Baker's family. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please go to studiostillwater.net to leave us a review. We will catch up to you again in part 2. Central Park ain't country.